Friends, up till now, in the Marxist theories of international relations, we have discussed two major strands, and now we come to the third one, that is, we discussed world systems theory and Gramscianism. Now we are talking about critical theory. Critical theory in international relations is strongly influenced by the ideas of Karl Marx, Gramsci, and the Frankfurt School of Thought. Frankfurt School was a group of scholars based in Frankfurt, Germany, and therefore we got an omnibus term for them, that is Frankfurt School. From Marx, critical theory took a shared understanding that production with its class relations is a central feature in the analysis of social, whether domestically or at the international level. So when we try to understand the social world, either domestically or at the international level, we need to look at the class relations. The unfairness of the prevailing relations of production is, in that sense, at the base or at the core of the critical theory's call for transformation of the international system. The Frankfurt School advocated some sort of post-Marxist view of politics and society. It distanced itself from Marxism both in terms of the centrality of the proletariat as the revolutionary guiding light, in terms of the positive understanding of technology as a force for social and economic development. It was at this, Frankfurt School, which was otherwise known as the Institute of Social Research in Frankfurt, the German thinker Max Horkheimer, who originally developed the term critical theory. In social theory, it was done by contrasting it with the traditional understanding of theory. According to Horkheimer, traditional theory was concerned with separation of object and subject, understanding science as something which was value-free with a mere explanatory value. But critical theory understood theory as part of social and political life, where it is inextricably linked with the social and political life, with the possibility of promoting the emancipation of the individual through knowledge. So this approach to critical theory has three main driving forces. One, it is the belief that society of its times, that is the times when the Frankfurt School thinkers were there in the 1930s, it needed a radical transformation and not only reform. So critical theorists' main concern was to change the existing system, because as per their understanding, the existing system was extremely exploitative, and therefore some radical transformation was needed for the emancipation of man in this context. Then the other driving force for this approach was that theory had always had a particular social context from which it could not and should not be separated. And the third driving force was that Horkheimer rejected the idea that social sciences could have independent objective theories. So theories had to be in some way or the other linked with the social and political context. They could never be objective as most theories hitherto had claimed. Now, all theorists associated with this particular school of thought were seeking the question of illumination. They were seeking this question of illumination, and rather, I was wrong, when I said about illumination. They were talking about emancipation in world politics. So their basic focus was on emancipation, and that is what they wanted to create in world politics. So these group of thinkers argued that the working class people had been absorbed by the system, and therefore they did not pose any threat to the system. This is, to use the phrase of Marcuse, is that we are living in a one-dimensional society, to which a vast majority cannot even think of having an alternative. So the light which was put by this group of theorists was on a particular kind of society in which we live, which Marcuse has talked, as I mentioned, as a one-dimensional society. It is a society, like for example, you are sitting in a cinema hall where all the seats are fixed, and when we go and sit in the cinema hall, we are all looking in one single direction, and we are looking at the screen, and we are not looking at any other place, not on the back, from where that film is being beamed on the screen. So whatever is on the screen, that is what the structure of this system forces us to look at. So everybody is looking at things in front, which the system makes visible for you. And therefore, his argument is that the working class or the proletariat has simply been absorbed in this system, where the system is so structured that you only look in one dimension, and therefore you are made to see things which the system wants you to see. Actually, you think that you are seeing everything, but you do not have that kind of a choice. So critical theories are skeptical of the some of the key assumptions on which mainstream theories are based. Starting with its state-centric tendencies. They understand state as a historically situated social construction whose main aim is to maintain and reproduce a specific order by defining clear boundaries between who is inside and who is outside. So the social construction is so cleverly, intelligently architectured that who is inside the system and who is outside the system, that is inherent in the design of that structure. So state basically functions as a machine, of inclusion and exclusion. Critical theory is explicitly normative. The urge for transformation and promotion of some sort of social emancipation guides the works of many of the authors who are classified as those belonging to this category. In this regard, critical theory asks questions about the normative, sociological, and praxeological conditions of emancipation, that is its meaning, conditions, and means. So therefore, critical theory basically questions the prevailing order in every possible way. How that order came into existence, what are the underlying process of historical change, and how critical theory is different from problem-solving theories. So they are trying to constantly adjust to changing concepts and objects, which is their basic purpose to explain and elaborate upon. Now, emancipation means different things to different people, because if we look at the past, at the history of the world, a lot of unspeakable and very atrocious things have been done in the name of emancipation, like imperialism and colonialism. All these practices, of imperialism and colonialism or any other such phenomena were done in the name of emancipation. Sometimes it was the white man's burden to emancipate people of the backward parts of the world, or sometimes some other excuse was invoked, but it was all done in the name of emancipation. Critical theory has given very sustained consideration to what human capacities are invoked in calls for human emancipation, and in this way it has contributed to creating a framework for a truly more emancipated world, which should be emancipated in the true sense of the term. It should not be some kind of a political misuse of the term emancipation, whereby one's own exploitation is camouflaged as emancipation. For critical theorists, many of them, emancipation was understood in terms of reconciliation with nature. Now, here the critical theorists are some way, in contradiction with Marx, whereby Marx, when he was talking about nature, he talked about control over forces of nature. And he meant that it was man, who was in the pursuit of such capabilities which could rather lead to the control of forces of nature. Here, in this context, the critical theorists argue that humanity's domination over nature has happened in the past at great cost. So, whenever we have tried, or human beings have tried to control nature, that has entailed a lot of cost for certain sections of humanity. Because in this game of conquering nature, or in this pursuit, or in this name of this pursuit of nature, of conquering nature, man easily tends to slip into the quest of dominating other human beings. So the pretext is that we are trying to control nature, or conquer the wild forces of nature, but eventually we end up dominating or other human beings in this, in the name of controlling the forces of nature. We eventually end up controlling human beings here. So that is something which has to be understood, and that is what has been pointed over by the critical theorist. And he says, and they argue that we need to reconcile with nature. And therefore, the most recent critical theorists like Habermas, for example, they stressed upon the centrality of communication and dialogue, which would lead to true emancipation. His argument is that the path to emancipation is through radical democracy. We need to overcome the social, political, and economic barriers to participation in the real sense. Because he argues that there are a lot of barriers here in the society. Many of them are not even visible, which do not allow human beings to, or all human beings to truly participate in the democracy. And what happens actually is that the participation which is apparently visible as real is not truly real. So therefore, that true participation of people, of all people in democratic processes, need to be ensured, and that participation should not stop at the borders of a country, the borders which we have created, which are man-made borders of countries, whereby we have divided the countries of the world into so many nation states. So that participation should not be limited by the boundaries of the state. This perspective, of Habermas has been more clearly applied by a political scientist named as Andrew Linklater, who has been credited with the application of the ideas of critical theory to international relations. So he is known as one of the most prominent critical theorists in IR field, and he argues that emancipation in the field of IR means expanding the boundaries of the state. And expanding the boundaries of the state, when he is talking about it, he means the moral boundaries of the state. And therefore he argues that in effect, the man-made borders of the states, which we have created in the name of different nation states in the world, they lose their moral and ethical significance in the pursuit of emancipation. So therefore, as in today's world where there is this overpowering concept of sovereignty of states, which is inviolable and which is final, which is immutable, and it should not be crossed at any costs. So that idea of the immutability and inviolability of sovereignty or sovereign borders of the state has been questioned by Linklater. He says that these borders do not have any moral and ethical significance when we are in the pursuit of emancipation. So, in the interest of emancipation, even when these boundaries, man-made boundaries have to be transcended, they should be transcended or they need to be transcended. Because, and he says that since the time of the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, this particular idea has got so entrenched in our minds, that we have taken these boundaries of the states which have been created by men as such sacred boundaries that we can't transcend them. So he says that the need is to rid ourselves of that kind of a hangover, and we need to expand these boundaries to include even non-citizens. So even if people who are technically called as non-citizens, they also need to be included in this category in this pursuit of emancipation, because when you are in the pursuit of emancipation of human beings, all human beings are one, whether you categorize them technically, legally as citizens or non-citizens, but they all need to be taken as the same and one, and that is what Linklater is arguing here. So he argues that we need to search for opportunities of change rather than only critiquing the present system, and that is what is, as we discussed in the very beginning, what is the uniqueness of critical theory, when they are not only trying to understand the situation, as it is in the world and how exploitative tendencies are operating in the international system, but they are also trying to give us the ray of hope that how that exploitative system can be changed and what are the possibilities of change which exist in the present structure, in which we operate. So therefore, he also calls for opportunities for change, and he says that in the present world, change is actually happening. And he cites the example of the European Union as a progressive or emancipatory tendency in the international arena, because EU started with very humble beginnings, and slowly and gradually what we saw that the countries were able to look at issues, beyond their technical boundaries, and today, that is a very progressive kind of regional organization where there are transnational links, among countries, and there are supranational organizations, and countries which are members of the EU are happy to operate within that framework. Once they are voluntarily agreeable to work in that framework, once they are willingly there, even if they are free to leave the EU, and more countries want to come into the EU, they want to be members of the European Union, that means that it is something, which is beneficial for them. So countries are understanding the utility of looking beyond their borders. So if they can be more, altruistic, they can be more open, they can be more inclusive in terms of understanding about human beings who inhabit their territories, it would be more beneficial for them, and that is what countries on the European continent have realized with time. So therefore, the explanation which has been given here by Andrew Linklater is something whereby he is trying to say that this present international system has got a lot of contradictions, the democracy which we understand as democracy is not true, and therefore we need some kind of a radical democracy, some kind of a more inclusive thinking of democracy, whereby we are more inclusive to people, even to those people whom we categorize as non-citizens. And then he comes to the practical example and he cites the development of the EU as something which is so very progressive in the modern world. So this is the basic idea about critical theory, where the thinkers basically are from the Frankfurt School, but when we come to its application in the field of IR, we have some contemporary thinkers like, as I mentioned, Andrew Linklater, who has given a very nice explanation or application of critical theory in the field of IR. Now, the fourth and final strand of thought within the Marxist framework of international relations is new Marxism. Now, this is a strand of thought within Marxism which includes thinkers who derive their ideas directly from Marx. They say that there are certain writings of Marx which have been given so much of prominence. A lot of people follow these writings, and all the understandings about Marx are based only on those selected ideas of Marx. But there are some other works of Marx which have been hitherto ignored, but which have a lot of significance, especially for the present times. And therefore, what is required is that we need to understand those ideas of Marx. Rather, we need to revisit Marx and bring those ideas and try to understand the present international system against the backdrop of those very important, useful ideas of Marx. So they argue that some of the ideas of Marx that were fundamental have been ignored by scholars as yet, and therefore their claim is that there has been some development in Marxism, as a consequence of a very selective reading of Marx. There has been development in Marxism which is very much un-Marxist, and therefore they are very critical of these developments, and they say that it is a disservice to Marx if we do a very selective reading of Marx, and therefore we need to understand Marx more holistically, taking into account his other writings, and then try to see, how those writings are applicable to the present international system. And therefore, these writers under the category of new Marxism, they come up with their own explanations, taking into account those original ideas of Karl Marx. So therefore, neo-Marxism is a new strand in international relations which actually relates to the Marxist view of international politics. And in the next segment, we will discuss about two prominent scholars who are associated with this category and look at their arguments, how they have tried to take their cue from Karl Marx and then try to apply it to the present international system to understand what are the problems with the present international system and what can be the operational mechanism to take the world to a better or a more equitable and just situation as rather explained by these thinkers. Thank you.